A black woman, fresh off a long-haul flight, steps into the airport eager to reunite with her family. But the moment she crosses the terminal, something shifts. A routine encounter with a flight attendant spirals into something far more unsettling. Her every move is questioned. Her seat on the plane becomes a battleground. And by the time the plane lands, she's pulled aside as if she's done something wrong without cause, without reason. 7 minutes later, the airline's CEO gets involved. What happened next sent shockwaves through the entire industry. And the ripple effects are still being felt today. Stay with me, this is a story you won't forget. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. If this story moves you, hit that subscribe button for more stories that challenge and inspire. This was supposed to be just another flight, but what happened next changed everything. The hum of the airport was a familiar sound to Tasha Kane. Airports were her second home between business trips, conferences, and the quiet visits to see her father. She had grown accustomed to the rhythmic shuffle of travelers. But today, something felt different. Maybe it was the weight of the afternoon light pouring through the tall glass windows, or the way the air seemed heavier than usual, pressing down on her shoulders like an unspoken warning. She stepped onto the jet bridge with the quiet confidence of someone used to moving through spaces where she was not entirely welcome. It wasn't the glaring, overt sort of unwelcome, the kind that shouted in faces or raised fists, but rather the subtle, polite kind. The kind that lived in the glances that lasted too long and the conversations that quieted as she approached. As she walked toward her seat in first class, heads lifted briefly, and she caught the flicker of recognition in their eyes. Or was it something else? Tasha had long since stopped trying to name it. The truth was, Tasha carried two burdens every time she traveled. One was her luggage, sleek and modest despite the power of her last name. The other was far heavier, the weight of assumptions. Her father, David Kane, had made sure she never flew on his airline without knowing exactly how to navigate it. It was one of the first lessons he'd taught her: you'll always be watched. He'd said, even when you think they aren't looking. She'd always thought he meant it figuratively. Today, she wasn't so sure. The flight attendant, Samantha, greeted the first-class passengers with a bright, rehearsed smile that faltered only slightly when she saw Tasha. It was brief, hardly noticeable. The kind of thing most people wouldn't catch. But Tasha wasn't most people. She had spent years noticing these moments, cataloging them, like pieces of a puzzle she never wanted to solve. As she settled into her seat, she placed her bag in front of her, slightly too heavy for the overhead compartment. Samantha passed by, helping a man 2 rows ahead with his luggage, chatting cheerfully as she lifted his bag with ease. Tasha waited. When Samantha reached her, the light in her eyes dimmed. Tasha smiled politely. Would you mind helping me with this? She asked, keeping her voice even. Samantha hesitated. A second passed. Then 2. Of course, she said, but the cheer was gone. She lifted the bag with a little too much effort, a little too much exhale, as if to make sure everyone around noticed the inconvenience. Tasha thanked her softly, and then Samantha said it. A simple thing, harmless on the surface, just making sure everything fits. We try to keep things organized up here. Tasha let the words hang in the air. She had heard them before, different words, same tone, the kind that carried the weight of meaning far beyond their syllables. It should fit, Tasha replied, her smile unwavering. Samantha nodded but didn't move on immediately. She lingered, as if waiting for something. A mistake, a misstep. But Tasha gave her nothing. The plane filled quickly after that. But the discomfort didn't leave. It sat next to Tasha like an unwelcome passenger, persistent and heavy. She glanced at the other travelers in first-class suits, pearls, briefcases. No one else seemed to carry what she did. It was a small thing. But that was the trouble with small things. They had a way of piling up until they were no longer small at all. By the time the plane pulled away from the gate, Tasha was already counting them. The plane ascended smoothly, breaking through the cloud cover as if peeling back the layers of something unseen. Something fragile. From her window seat, Tasha Kane watched the world shrink beneath her. But she could not escape the tightening in her chest. It wasn't the altitude. It was the quiet. The kind of quiet that followed her into rooms where no one expected her to be. It wasn't aggressive, it was careful. Watchful. Like the silence that falls in a room when someone accidentally says too much. Tasha had learned to live in this kind of quiet long ago. Samantha passed by again, moving briskly down the aisle with a practiced ease. Her posture straightened slightly when she neared Tasha's row, but her eyes avoided direct contact. She smiled at the passengers ahead and behind but skipped over Tasha as if she were invisible. It was a small omission, hardly worth mentioning, but Tasha knew better. The thing about silence is that it speaks. And often, it tells the whole truth. Tasha shifted in her seat, adjusting the blanket draped over her lap. From the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of a man across the aisle. Middle-aged, navy suit, silver cufflinks that caught the overhead light. His eyes flicked toward her just long enough to register curiosity before he returned to his newspaper. She could feel the questions lingering just beneath the surface. Who is she? How did she afford this seat? Why does she belong here? None of it was said aloud. It didn't have to be. Tasha had spent years navigating rooms filled with men like him, polite, respectful, but with that same unspoken question stitched into the corners of their polite smiles. A request for a glass of water might turn into a moment of hesitation. A trip to the restroom could mean being asked gently if she was heading toward the economy section. These were not the stories they wrote headlines about, but they were the stories that shaped the days of women like Tasha. Stories that rarely had a climax but left bruises all the same. The flight attendants began moving through the cabin with trays of drinks. Samantha reappeared, stopping at each row with the same rehearsed pleasantries. When she reached Tasha's seat, her tone shifted by half a degree. Would you like something to drink? Tasha glanced up. She could hear the faintest edge in Samantha's voice, not unfriendly, but careful. There it was again, that hesitation. I'll have water, Tasha replied, her voice as calm as ever. Samantha poured the glass with a little too much precision, as if performing the task for the first time. She handed it over quickly, fingers grazing the rim in a way that felt impersonal. Thank you, Tasha said softly, but Samantha was already gone. Moving to the next row, the man across the aisle lowered his paper and sipped his whiskey slowly, his eyes flickering toward Tasha's untouched water. She felt the weight of his gaze but didn't meet it. Instead, she let the silence settle, folding itself neatly around her. The plane leveled out, and the cabin lights dimmed slightly. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the horizon in shades of gold and lavender. It was beautiful, Tasha thought, how the sky could look so endless, so open, while the space within the plane felt smaller by the second. The woman sitting one row ahead shifted in her seat and reclined slightly. Tasha decided to follow suit, easing back until she felt the soft click of the seat locking into place. Barely a moment passed before Samantha appeared again. Miss, I'm going to have to ask you to keep your seat upright, she said, leaning in slightly. We're about to begin meal service. Tasha hesitated, glancing at the rows around her. 3 other seats were reclined, none of them had been asked to adjust. I'm sorry, Tasha said carefully. I thought it was fine since we're at cruising altitude. It's just for now, Samantha replied, her tone flat, eyes flicking away. Tasha straightened her seat without another word. Small things, always the small things. But they accumulated, gathering like storm clouds in the distance. By the time the meal trays arrived, the man across the aisle was watching more openly. His curiosity had transformed into something else, interest laced with quiet amusement, as if waiting to see how long it would take for the next drop to fall. Tasha ate in silence, forcing herself to focus on the book in her lap, but the words blurred together. And she knew, deep down, that this was not the last of it. There was always another cloud waiting. The meal trays were cleared away, and the hum of the engine settled into a low, constant thrum. Outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky stretched dark and endless. In the quiet, the cabin felt smaller, like the walls were inching closer, as if the air itself carried the weight of something left unsaid. Tasha King leaned back in her seat, careful not to recline this time. She'd learned to choose her battles. Samantha moved through the aisle with mechanical efficiency, her eyes skimming the rows but never lingering too long on any one passenger. But each time she passed by Tasha's row, there was the slightest shift, the subtle tightening of her jaw, the way her hands smoothed her apron a little too deliberately. The man across the aisle noticed, too. His gaze flicked between Tasha and Samantha, curiosity deepening into something colder. Tasha could feel it the way people watched. It was an old feeling, as familiar as the texture of her skin. It wasn't anger or malice that filled the space between them. It was something quieter, something Samantha probably didn't even recognize in herself. That was the trouble with prejudice. It rarely shouted, it whispered. Tasha knew this wasn't about the seat or the water or even the way Samantha avoided her eyes. This was about the way certain people carried their presence, how it unsettled those who weren't ready for it. The incident with the seat was only the beginning. When Samantha passed by again, her attention fixed on Tasha's phone resting in the tray table's groove. Tasha had barely glanced at it, just a quick check for messages. But Samantha slowed her pace. "Miss," Samantha said, her voice soft but edged, "we ask that phones remain on airplane mode during the flight." Tasha's brow lifted slightly. "It is." Samantha didn't move. "I just noticed," Samantha began, but her words trailed off, drifting into the space between assumption and accusation. Tasha held her gaze. She could have argued, could have asked why Samantha hadn't paused at the man across the aisle, whose phone was still glowing faintly in his lap. But she didn't, because she knew how this game was played. Tasha placed the phone face down, folding her hands neatly over her lap. "I'll keep it away," she said calmly. Samantha nodded, but there was something unsatisfied in her expression, as if she'd been hoping for a reason to escalate. And that was when Tasha realized Samantha wasn't just enforcing rules. She was searching for a reason, an excuse, a justification for the discomfort she felt in Tasha's presence. It wasn't about the phone. It never was. The man across the aisle smirked, tilting his whiskey glass just enough for the ice to rattle. He wasn't entertained by Tasha. He was entertained by the way the world bent itself around her, as if watching to see if she would crack under the weight of it. She wouldn't. Tasha had grown up in rooms where she wasn't wanted. Her father's business meetings, galas where she was the only black face in a sea of pressed suits and pearls. She learned early that her silence spoke louder than words. But the silence of this plane felt different. It wasn't just Samantha. It was the passengers 2 rows ahead who stole glances. The older couple who whispered to each other but fell silent when she walked past. And maybe, Tasha thought, this was what her father meant when he told her about flying. "You'll always be noticed," he had said, "even if they don't know your name. Even if they don't know you belong to me." David King had lived through worse. He built his empire brick by brick, knowing each one was stacked against him from the start. Tasha inherited more than his name. She inherited the quiet armor he carried everywhere he went. But even armor grew heavy. Samantha's footsteps receded down the aisle. But Tasha knew she would return. This wasn't over. The phone incident had been her second warning. A third was inevitable. It was never just one thing. It was always a collection. The ice in the whiskey glass clinked again. The man across the aisle leaned slightly in her direction, lowering his voice just enough to keep it private. "She's watching you," he said, the faintest trace of amusement in his tone. Tasha turned toward him, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. She smiled faintly. "I know," he chuckled under his breath, taking another sip. "You must get that a lot." She didn't answer. Because what was there to say? Yes, she got it a lot. No, it didn't surprise her. But what people like him never understood was that getting used to something didn't make it right. A lifetime of swallowing these moments didn't dull their edge. It only taught her how to hide the stain. The plane continued forward, but time moved slower in the cabin. Tasha glanced at the seatbelt sign overhead. But it wasn't illuminated. She considered rising, stretching her legs, walking down the aisle just to remind herself that she could. But she stayed seated, because she could feel the tension. The invisible line she had unknowingly crossed the moment she boarded. There was still time for one more small thing. There always was. And when it came, Tasha knew she would face it the same way she always had. Quietly, steadily, like her father taught her. The quiet had grown teeth. By the time the plane's cabin lights dimmed for the evening portion of the flight, Tasha could feel the shift in the air. The kind of shift you sense when you walk into a room where someone's been talking about you. It wasn't overt, not yet, but it hummed low beneath the surface. She tried to lose herself in the book resting in her lap. But the words didn't stick. Across the aisle, the man with the whiskey had fallen asleep. His head tilted slightly toward the window. Breath slow and even. He hadn't spoken to her again after his passing comment. But the trace of his smirk lingered in the air, like perfume that wouldn't wash out. Samantha had disappeared briefly. But Tasha knew she would return. That was the thing about these moments, about the whispers of prejudice that threaded themselves into the fabric of daily life. They followed patterns. There was a rhythm to it. And Tasha had memorized every beat. The first warning had been subtle. The hesitation with the overhead luggage. The second, sharper, the phone. And the third? It was coming. She could feel it looming ahead. Inevitable as turbulence. Tasha shifted in her seat, glancing toward the front of the plane where the curtain separated first class from the rest of the passengers. The line between comfort and exclusion was thin, and she was sitting right on the edge of it. She almost wished her father were here. Not because she needed him to intervene, but because David King's presence alone altered the atmosphere of a room. His silence filled the space, demanding recognition, the way old trees anchor themselves into the earth. But she wasn't her father. And that was the point. Her phone, though powered down, felt heavy on the tray table. She wondered if Samantha was waiting for another opportunity to say something. Another excuse to question her. The curtain at the front of the cabin shifted. And there she was. Samantha moved down the aisle, her steps light but purposeful. Tasha braced herself. She felt it before Samantha even spoke, the slight pause in her stride. The half-second hesitation just before stopping at Tasha's row. "Miss," Samantha began softly, crouching slightly to meet her eye level. There was an unusual sweetness in her voice now, the kind used to soften a blow. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I need to ask you something." Tasha set her book aside slowly, carefully. "Of course." Samantha's gaze flickered toward the empty water glass on Tasha's tray table as if she were looking for something to latch onto. A justification for this interruption. "We received a concern from another passenger." There it was. Tasha's grip tightened subtly on the armrest. She didn't look away. "Oh," she replied, keeping her voice even. "What concern?" Samantha's eyes darted briefly to the man across the aisle, who was still sleeping. She hesitated just long enough for Tasha to understand what wasn't being said. "There was mention," Samantha continued, "that you may have been filming the cabin earlier." Tasha blinked. Filming? It wasn't surprising. These things rarely were. "No, I wasn't," Tasha said plainly. Samantha smiled, but it was thin like stretched fabric on the verge of tearing. "I understand. I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding. But for the comfort of all our passengers, I have to ask you to refrain from using your phone, even to check messages, during the flight." Tasha exhaled slowly, pressing down the heat rising in her chest. She glanced again at the man across the aisle, his head still tilted toward the window. Eyes closed. "I'll make sure to follow the rules," she said carefully, her words balanced like glass on a ledge. Samantha nodded, standing upright. "Thank you for understanding." And just like that, she disappeared down the aisle again. Tasha's fingers brushed the smooth surface of her phone, but she didn't reach for it. Not now. Filming the cabin. It wasn't new. It had happened before. In stores. In boardrooms. The assumption that her presence warranted surveillance. That she must be documenting something. Gathering proof. The irony, of course, was that she didn't need to document anything. The proof was always there. Woven into the day-to-day moments. Invisible to anyone not trained to see it. She wondered who had lodged the complaint. The man across the aisle? The older woman 2 rows ahead who hadn't looked at her directly since the flight began. Or maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the complaint wasn't lodged by anyone at all. Maybe it was just Samantha. The cabin lights dimmed further, casting long shadows across the ceiling. The rhythm was predictable, but that didn't make it easier. For the rest of the flight, Tasha sat still, staring at the soft glow of the seatbelt sign. She thought about her father, about the quiet weight he carried in his chest each day, and she wondered how much of that weight was already settling into her own bones. Outside the window, the stars stretched endlessly across the sky. But inside the cabin, the walls kept closing in. The hush of the cabin thickened as the hours passed. But beneath it, tension simmered, quiet, but constant, the kind of tension that thrived in polite spaces. Tasha King sat unmoving, eyes fixed on the seat in front of her. But her mind was elsewhere, circling the same thought. Who complained? That was the trick about these moments. It wasn't just the incident itself, it was the way it lingered afterward. Leaving behind questions you couldn't answer. Questions that gnawed at the edges of your peace. She thought again about Samantha's carefully chosen words. Her forced smile. A concern from another passenger. There was no name, no specific detail, only the vague weight of accusation hanging over Tasha like a fog. Whoever it was didn't need to explain themselves. They didn't need to raise their voice. Didn't need to point or make a scene. A glance was enough. A whisper. Maybe. A simple suggestion that something felt out of place. And it was always someone like Tasha who ended up being the out of place. Her father once told her that the most dangerous thing about racism wasn't hatred, it was suspicion. Hatred burns out, he had said, but suspicion lingers. It festers. And when people see you through that lens, they don't need proof. The idea of you is enough. Tasha shifted in her seat. Crossing her legs slowly, she glanced across the aisle. The man with the whiskey had stirred, one eye cracking open just long enough to check the time. He caught her gaze and smiled faintly. "Everything all right?" he asked, voice thick with sleep. It wasn't kindness in his tone, it was curiosity. Tasha smiled back, though it barely touched her lips. "Everything's fine." The lie was too easy. But it was a lie she'd told all her life. And by now, it rolled off her tongue without hesitation. Because what else was she supposed to say? That she felt every glance like a weight on her skin? That every movement, every sip of water or shift in her seat felt scrutinized? That she knew, deep down, the line between being seen as calm and difficult was razor thin? The unwritten rules of the world were clearer on flights. Be polite, be quiet, don't ask for too much. Don't give them a reason to remember you. Tasha had followed those rules her entire life. And yet, somehow, here she was suspected of filming the cabin simply because she existed in it. Samantha's shadow flickered at the edge of her vision. Tasha didn't flinch. She let the moment stretch, as if daring the flight attendant to speak again. But Samantha walked past this time without pause, disappearing behind the curtain that led to the galley. For now, Tasha exhaled slowly, feeling the hum of the engines beneath her feet. The irony was that she could have ended this at any moment. All it would take was one phone call, one message to her father, and David King's name alone would unravel everything. But Tasha had spent her life trying not to be that person. She never wanted to be the CEO's daughter, the one people whispered about in boardrooms, the woman who used her father's power like a sledgehammer. She wanted to stand on her own. Even now, even when the weight of injustice pressed into her like a stone. She hesitated, because asking for help even when justified meant proving them right. It meant confirming the suspicion that she was someone who didn't belong there in the first place. They already think you're too much, she thought bitterly. Don't give them more. The plane rocked slightly with turbulence. But Tasha remained still. She remembered something else her father had said once, during a rare evening at home when she was 16. The hardest part of living in this world isn't fighting the battles they throw at you, Tasha. It's the moments after, when you sit alone with it. That's when it sinks in. He was right. She could feel it sinking in now. The plane dipped again, and Samantha's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and professional, reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts. Tasha's seatbelt was already tight, but she tugged at it anyway, as if bracing for something else, something she couldn't see but knew was coming. And maybe that was the worst part. Not the complaints, not the warnings, but the waiting. The knowing that there was always one more thing. It didn't matter how many degrees she had. It didn't matter how high she climbed in her career. Some part of the world would always see her as out of place. And it wasn't hatred. It was suspicion. The cabin lights were low now, casting soft shadows across the faces of the sleeping passengers. Tasha King wasn't sleeping. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the tray table. Her breathing measured, but inside, she was walking an old road, one she'd traveled too many times. The third warning hadn't come yet. And that was the problem. It wasn't the conflict she feared. It was the space before it, the long, drawn-out silence where doubt began to curl inward. She thought of something her grandmother used to say. They don't need to chase you anymore, Tasha. They just build the walls and watch you run into them. Tasha felt the walls now. The curtain to the galley shifted, and Samantha reappeared, her silhouette outlined against the glow from the back of the plane. She moved with the kind of ease that came from knowing the world was shaped to fit her. Samantha wasn't cruel. She wasn't snarling or glaring. That's what made it worse. She believed she was right. And that belief, calm, polite, unwavering, was sharper than any open hostility. Tasha had seen it before. In boardrooms where her suggestions were met with thin smiles and redirected conversations. In restaurants where the check was handed to the person next to her, even if she was the one who had paid for the meal. The world rarely shouted. It preferred to whisper. Samantha stopped 2 rows ahead, speaking softly to another passenger. Tasha couldn't hear the words, but she saw the ease in Samantha's shoulders, the way she laughed lightly at something the man said. And Tasha knew, with bone-deep certainty, that when Samantha finally made her way back to her row, the tone would shift. The sweetness would thin, because the rules were different. They always were. The plane dipped slightly, and a murmur rippled through the cabin as a few passengers stirred awake. The man across the aisle stretched, blinking slowly as he glanced at his watch. His eyes drifted toward Tasha, resting there for a moment too long. "Not tired?" he asked, his voice low. Tasha shook her head, offering a small smile. "No." He nodded, but the question lingered between them. Unspoken. "Why aren't you sleeping?" But Tasha didn't feel like explaining the weight pressing against her ribs. The weight that had nothing to do with altitude. Samantha reappeared. This time, she didn't stop at the rows ahead. She went straight to Tasha. "Miss Kane," she began, her voice dipped in honey but with an edge just beneath it. "I'm sorry to bother you again." Again. The word sat heavy in the space between them. Tasha looked up, meeting her gaze. "Is there something else?" Samantha hesitated. "I need to ask you to step to the back with me for a moment." It wasn't a question. Tasha knew better than to protest. The plane felt smaller as she stood, following Samantha down the narrow aisle. The eyes of the few awake passengers flicked toward her, curiosity flickering like candlelight. She felt it again, that old, familiar hum beneath the surface. They were waiting to see what she had done. In the galley, Samantha closed the curtain behind them. The small space felt suffocating, the air thin. "I wanted to have this conversation privately," Samantha began, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "A passenger has expressed discomfort. They felt you might have been recording them earlier." Tasha's heart slowed. It wasn't surprise that filled her, it was recognition. She had been here before. The details were different, but the map was always the same. "I wasn't recording anyone," Tasha said, her voice steady. Samantha smiled in that tight, professional way. "I'm sure it was a misunderstanding." But the passenger was quite insistent. "We want to make sure everyone feels comfortable during the flight." Tasha exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Comfort. The word stretched itself thin, unraveling in front of her. Whose comfort, exactly? She thought of the passengers in first class, half of whom had their phones out at some point during the flight. No one had been asked to step into the galley. No one had been quietly questioned behind a curtain. Except her. Tasha straightened, letting the silence settle until it became something solid between them. "I understand," she said finally. "But let me ask you something." Samantha blinked. "Of course. Did you ask anyone else to step back here?" The question hung there, sharp and unwavering. Samantha's smile faltered. "We just want to ensure." "I know what you're trying to ensure," Tasha interrupted softly. Samantha's hands twitched, as if she were trying to smooth out invisible wrinkles. "This isn't personal," Samantha added quickly. "I hope you understand that." But it was personal. It always was. Tasha let the silence stretch further, forcing Samantha to sit with it. Because some lessons couldn't be taught with words. Finally, Samantha stepped back, the confidence in her stance flickering for just a moment. "I appreciate your cooperation," she said quietly, opening the curtain once more. Tasha stepped back into the cabin, feeling the weight of every glance that followed her to her seat. She sat down slowly, her body sinking into the leather as if it might swallow her whole. But the weight didn't leave. It never did. And as the plane soared forward, Tasha understood that this was the real test. Not the confrontation itself, but the knowing that the next flight, the next meeting, the next room might hold the same invisible walls. She sat quietly, staring at the seatbelt sign as it glowed faintly above her. Her father had been right. The hardest part wasn't the fight. It was the sitting, the waiting, the knowing. Tasha King's eyes traced the contours of the seat in front of her. But her mind was far from the cabin. She had crossed a threshold, one she recognized well, though she had never seen it marked. The cabin was still. Most of the passengers were asleep, the hum of the engines lulling them into easy rest. But for Tasha, rest was a distant thing. She could feel it now, the delicate balance of power that governed places like this. Airplanes, restaurants, country clubs, spaces that prided themselves on civility but built their walls high enough to ensure certain people felt the weight of their presence. Tasha had stepped into this space fully aware of the terms. She had grown up understanding that her father's wealth opened doors. But it didn't always grant her welcome. That was the price of being seen. The price of being other in spaces designed for comfort that did not include her. Samantha had not returned since their conversation in the galley. Tasha could only assume the stewardess felt the matter was resolved. But that was the trouble for Samantha. It was already over. For Tasha, it wasn't. It would stay with her long after the plane touched down. It would be folded into the archives of every other moment like it. Joining the silent collection she carried but rarely spoke of. The man across the aisle shifted, glancing over at her with quiet curiosity. "You handled that well," he said, breaking the silence between them. Tasha's head turned slightly, her eyes meeting his. "Handled what?" His mouth curled at the edges, not a smile, but something adjacent to it. "I've seen things like that escalate," he said. "I figured you'd be louder about it." Louder. The word clung to the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Tasha breathed in slowly. She had heard this before. In different variations. People often mistook her composure for weakness or restraint for submission. "I've learned not to give people what they expect," she replied, her voice steady. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "As if studying her. Smart," he said, "but exhausting, I imagine." She didn't answer right away. The weight of his words settled into her lap. Heavier than she expected. Because he wasn't wrong. It was exhausting, this constant measuring. The delicate work of shrinking herself just enough to avoid becoming a threat but not so much that she disappeared entirely. It was like living on a tightrope stretched over a drop that no one else could see. Tasha considered the man carefully. His suit was expensive but worn at the elbows. His watch glinted in the low cabin light. He seemed like the kind of person who occupied spaces like this without thinking twice about it. "You said you've seen things like this escalate," she said. "What did you mean by that?" The man leaned back in his seat, his eyes drifting toward the ceiling as if recalling something distant. "People don't like feeling uncomfortable," he said finally. "And sometimes, it doesn't take much. The wrong tone, the wrong look, anything can make someone feel small. And when people feel small, they find ways to make someone else smaller." His eyes flicked back to her. "You must know that by now." Tasha held his gaze, her heart steady but slow. "I do," she said quietly. The plane tilted slightly as it began its descent. The shift in pressure, a reminder that this moment, like all the others, would soon pass. But Tasha knew the landing wouldn't erase it. There were no smooth landings when it came to things like this. Prejudice was a passenger that never fully disembarked. The intercom crackled to life, and Samantha's voice filtered through the cabin, instructing everyone to return their seats to an upright position. Tasha complied, but her mind lingered elsewhere. As the plane approached the runway, she thought of her father, of the countless times he must have sat in similar seats, swallowing the same weight she felt now. David King had built an empire by refusing to let moments like these break him. But Tasha wondered how much of him had been chipped away in the process. Perhaps strength wasn't measured by how much you could carry, but by how well you carried what the world refused to put down. The plane landed smoothly, but the tension did not ease. As passengers gathered their belongings, Tasha remained seated, letting the others file out ahead of her. She wasn't in a hurry. The man across the aisle lingered for a moment before standing. "For what it's worth," he said, adjusting his coat, "I think you belong here more than most of us." Tasha's lips curved faintly, but there was little comfort in his words. She didn't need his permission to belong. And yet, she nodded, offering a polite thank you as he disappeared down the aisle. When Tasha finally stood to retrieve her bag, Samantha was waiting near the exit, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "Thank you for flying with us, Miss Kane," Samantha said, her smile polite, professional. Tasha paused for just a breath. There was no apology in Samantha's eyes, only relief. Relief that Tasha had not become the problem she was expected to be. Tasha met her gaze evenly. "Safe travels," she replied softly, stepping past her and into the terminal. As she walked, the weight of the flight pressed against her back, but she carried it the way her father had taught her, with grace that did not seek approval and strength that did not ask for recognition. The world would not always make space for her. But she would sit at the table all the same. The terminal was alive with movement. But Tasha King walked slowly, letting the crowd flow around her. The polished floor gleamed underfoot, reflecting the bright white lights overhead. But the brightness did nothing to ease the weight she carried. Airports had a strange way of amplifying things. The discomfort, the second glances, the polite exclusion, they didn't fade when the plane landed. They only reshuffled themselves, waiting for the next opportunity to surface. As Tasha made her way toward the baggage claim, she felt the echoes of the flight still pressing against her. Not loudly, but like a hum she couldn't shake, a reminder that even the smallest of things left marks that lingered long after the moment passed. A few steps ahead, Samantha stood near the gate, chatting with another flight attendant. Tasha could see the ease in Samantha's posture, the relaxed curve of her shoulders now that the plane was empty and the perceived problem had disembarked. Samantha glanced in her direction briefly. Their eyes met for just a second, but Tasha saw the flicker, the momentary tightening of her jaw, the subtle shift in her stance. It was the look of someone hoping the conversation was over but suspecting it might not be. Tasha held her gaze long enough to let her know she had seen it. It wasn't over. Not for Tasha. She wasn't angry. Not exactly. Anger required energy she didn't feel like giving to this moment. What filled her instead was something quieter, but sharper, a cold clarity. She thought about calling her father. One phone call, one quiet word from David King, and this entire situation would unravel in Samantha's hands. But the problem was larger than Samantha. It always had been. Her father used to say that fighting racism wasn't like chopping down a tree, it was like cutting away fog. There was no single swing of an axe that could bring it to the ground. The fog drifted and reformed, filling spaces you thought were clear. This wasn't about revenge. It was about being seen. The conveyor belt at the baggage claim whirred to life, and Tasha stood beside it, waiting. A few of the other passengers from first class gathered nearby, chatting softly, casting glances in her direction as if trying to place her. She could hear their questions without needing to listen. Who was she? Why had the flight attendant pulled her aside? What had she done? The weight of their assumptions pressed down on her, invisible but undeniable. Her bag appeared on the carousel, sleek and understated. Tasha reached for it just as the man from across the aisle appeared beside her. "Looks like we made it," he said casually, lifting his own bag from the belt. Tasha nodded, adjusting the strap on her shoulder. "We did." He hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether to say more. Finally, he cleared his throat. "You know," he began, "I wasn't sure how that was going to play out back there." Tasha raised an eyebrow. "And what did you expect?" He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I've been around long enough to know how these things usually go." His tone wasn't unkind, but there was something in it that made Tasha pause. "And how do they usually go?" she asked. He shifted his weight, suddenly aware of the thin ice beneath his words. "Let's just say I've seen situations like that escalate. People don't always handle it as gracefully as you did." Tasha's gaze softened, but she didn't let him off the hook. "I appreciate the observation," she said, her voice calm, "but the truth is, it shouldn't have to be handled gracefully at all." The man's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, he seemed to understand the weight of her words. "That's fair," he admitted. Tasha exhaled slowly, her grip tightening on the handle of her bag. "I've learned," she said quietly, "that grace doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes, it's just another way of holding the weight until you can put it down somewhere safe." He studied her carefully, nodding as if to acknowledge something unspoken. "Well," he said, hoisting his bag over his shoulder, "I hope you find somewhere to put it down." Tasha's smile was faint but genuine. "Me too." As the man disappeared into the crowd, Tasha turned toward the exit. The cold air outside the terminal pressed against her skin as she stepped into the night. The city stretched out before her, indifferent to the quiet battle she had just fought. But Tasha carried something else with her now, not just the weight of what happened, but the understanding that these moments, these small collisions, were part of a larger map. A map her father had walked before her. A map she now walked herself. As she hailed a cab, she thought about the next flight she would take, the next room she would enter. And she knew without question that there would be another Samantha. Another test. Another chance for someone to remind her that belonging wasn't freely given. But Tasha also knew this. She wasn't asking for permission. The world would not always shift to accommodate her. But she would take her seat anyway.